بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم Subhanallah, what a beautiful evening with so many great people at the masjid, mashallah. Looking forward to a beautiful event tonight, inshallah. Um, First and foremost, thank you to our guest speaker who's visiting us all the way from the north side, mashallah. Ustadh Fahad Tasleem with Sapiens Institute. He's doing great work, mashallah. They also offer free counseling for youth and teenagers. You can also visit their website, and he is, mashallah, working tirelessly for many years on contemporary topics and contemporary issues relating to the new generation. So thank you so much, Ustadh, for making the trip out here today, all the way to Sugarland, from all the way to Champions. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. The topic today is an amazing topic. It's something different and it's something that we're not really used to hearing. But alhamdulillah, because we have scholars and teachers like Fahad Tasleem, we're able to tackle these topics. From an Islamic point of view, inshallah, we're going to be covering the response to LGBTQ because it is becoming a rising issue on school, on government level, political level, on all kinds of levels. And many times we're not clear when it comes to the Islamic point. For us Muslims, the teachings, the guidelines, and the boundaries and the value system comes from two sources. One is the Quran and one is the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Anything outside of that we reject as Muslim, and alhamdulillah, that is our primary source of guidance. One of the scholars that I was visiting, and he said that in order for us to learn the deen, in order for us to learn, our tradition, our value, our culture system of Islam, we need to go back in history. We need to go back to the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now that's a confusion. Someone might say that why do we have to go back in the old ways? That's not to say that we have to go back into the old ways. We have to go back into the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, but the methodology, the approach, we need to employ, which is the most latest, which is the most advanced, and alhamdulillah, we are doing that. Jazakumullah khair. Tonight, Salatul Isha is at 9:50, inshallah, and we are going to conclude about 9:45. And if we have some time to take Q&A afterwards, if we have time, we'll try to do it before. If the topic goes in length, inshallah, then we can go and have the Q&A after Salatul Isha as well, inshallah. You can also ask your questions in writing, or you can just simply, we'll pass around the mic if needed. You can ask your questions then as well. So before I start, I want to quickly ask Sheikh Ustadh Fahad, before he gets into the introduction of the topic, what's the rainbow? So if I like rainbow ice cream, what does that make me? Is it halal rainbow ice cream? It's a halal rainbow ice cream. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khair without any delay.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. So this particular topic, you'll notice that the title is Reclaiming the Rainbow. And while I know there may be some focus on the rainbow part, but actually the focus should be on the reclaiming part, okay? So rainbow questions, we can take them, but those would be the last ones we take, inshallah, for the evening. Okay, but to get started, this particular topic, I'm sure that most of us have some sort of exposure to it. In fact, if you are following anything in the news, you know that there have been a couple of recent incidents where this topic has come up. So for instance, and specifically dealing with like Muslim communities around the United States. So just as a sampling of that, in Hamtramck, Michigan, for those of you who are familiar with that, in Hamtramck, Michigan, the city council there voted down to allow pride flags to be flown over government buildings and schools and things like that. Now, they have a 50% Muslim population, but the fact that they did that actually caused a lot of backlash, which they're still going through, right? And of course, they made their arguments and so on and so forth, but you are seeing incidents like this across the country, not so much in Texas, but across the country, okay? So we have Hamtramck, Michigan. for those of you who know about what's going on in Montgomery County, Maryland. So in Montgomery County, Maryland, one of the issues that arose there was that they have certain teachings they teach in the public school, right? So we're talking, and we're not just talking high school. This is middle school, perhaps even elementary school. Now, if a parent was privy to the fact that their children would be going, and on that day they'd be teaching a lot of this LGBTQ content, they could opt out for their children to not go to school that day. All right, they could opt out of that class. Now legislation came about to say, no, this should be required. In other words, you are not allowed to opt out to take your children out of that, to come to school on that day. All right. Now, the reasoning behind that was to say, look, we do not support bigotry in any context. And so just like if there was African American studies or something like this, that you would opt out of that, that is an indication of one's bigotry and racism. So now what parents were protesting this, they actually went out and protested against this move, okay? Now, whether it was actually put into legislation or not, that's yet to be seen as far as I know. So that was Montgomery County, Michigan. So if you're going across the U.S., you understand right now we're just in the north, okay? So you've got Hamtramck, Michigan, Montgomery County, Maryland, and if you go all the way to Virginia, right? Not Virginia, sorry, Washington, not Washington D.C., but Washington State. In Washington State, there was a person that was part of the city planning. He was the city planner, actually. So he's responsible for how the urban planning happens, what goes where, roads, and so on and so forth. And he made basically in front of the entire council, in front of the other leaders of the city, and so on and so forth. And this is I think, let me see, the name of the city is Sammamish, Washington. It's right outside Seattle. He gives this 6-minute khutbah, okay? Basically saying that, look, this particular idea of pride, LGBTQ, it runs antagonist to the Islamic paradigm, and I cannot work as a city planner in good conscience. And so therefore, I'm going to resign. Now, I'm not talking about the entire 6-minute khutbah he gave, but more or less, that's what he said. Now, this man is a business owner. He has 2 very lucrative restaurants, one in Sammamish, I think that's how you pronounce it, and one in Seattle. As soon as he said that, there were calls to boycott those restaurants, okay? And these calls are very real in the sense that you actually lose a lot of money. Now, why am I mentioning these things? What I'm mentioning here is that for a long time as a Muslim community, our goal was self-preservation. In the sense that, look, they do their thing, we do our thing, and our primary goal is just to preserve the Muslim community. Now, you might not like what I'm about to say, but I think that was a faux pas. I think that was a mistake. Because if the sole goal is just to preserve the Muslim community, all decisions that are made are only about preserving the community. And so what happens is when truth is not the sole goal and calling people to the truth is not the sole goal, and that takes a secondary, tertiary, or maybe worse, or maybe a lower priority, you find that you're going to run into times and places and situations where even though a person or a community wants to keep to themselves, they won't let you keep to yourself. So now we're coming to heads with these issues head on. Now, the thing about living in Texas is that many of you are probably not exposed to it, at least to the degree that they are in the north, or let's say the West Coast, and so on and so forth. But one thing we don't want to do is be like the ostrich, right? When he sees something coming, they just stick their head in the sand and say, okay, it'll just go by. We want to be proactive, all right? And believe it or not, we are late to the game, right? You might not be directly exposed to it yet, but you don't want to be in the situation where these things come up and they're knocking on your door and now you're trying to give a response, okay? So in that light, what I wanted to do was to give you a very simple response to the issue in and of itself that's going to be, you can say, codified in 3 simple points and what I call hidden assumptions. Now, why am I talking about hidden assumptions? Because a lot of the rhetoric that comes out from the LGBTQ community and that ideology has to do with vocabulary and verbiage and words, okay? And if you're not equipped with the ability to A, understand what's being said, and B, to be able to respond you're already in a losing battle. Okay, now let me give an example to clarify what I'm saying very quickly. You know, a lot of times when you speak to Christians, they may say, we are all sinners. And you as a Muslim say, yes, we agree, we are all sinners. But when a Christian says we are all sinners and a Muslim says we are all sinners, there is a whole range of philosophical and metaphysical baggage that comes with that statement. When a Christian says we are all sinners, what is he bringing or she bringing to the table? What they're bringing to the table is an assumption that Adam and Eve sinned. That sin is an original sin. Okay, and there's a lot more. I'm gonna have to make this very quick, but that is an original sin that is almost genetically part of our DNA in a sense. That goes on generation by generation, and a person has no agency, no free will in this area. You have this sin, you are born in this sin. So when they say we are all sinners, they are speaking about this as something that is immutable, like you cannot escape it, unless Jesus is sent, dies for your sins, and solves the sin problem. When a Muslim says we are all sinners, that is not what we're bringing to the table. When we say we are all sinners, we are saying, yes, we have a propensity to sin. And because we are not perfect beings, we lack knowledge, and so on and so forth, we will slip and we will sin. And that's part of our imperfection. And then we repent. And so it's a very different dynamic. And these assumptions carry on till today, as we're going to see. A lot of those assumptions that are part of, that start off in Christian Europe, there are remnants of that today that are part of the LGBTQ argument, okay? And I'll get to that when we get there. So I'm going to be presenting three what I call hidden assumptions. Those things that are in the backdrop that when someone comes to you and asks you a question about the LGBTQ ideology, right? Whether we're talking about, gays and lesbians, whether we're talking about the transgender ideology, whatever it is, there are three hidden assumptions that if you don't unpack, you cannot deal with the issue. There's a maxim in the Arabic language, and it goes something like, al-hukmu ala shay'i far'un ala tasawwurihi. That to truly judge a matter, you must properly conceptualize it. If you haven't conceptualized it, you're in a losing battle from the get-go. I'll give you an example. Is homosexuality haram? I'm not asking myself. Is it haram? Okay, 3 people said yes. Okay, 2 more sisters. Allahu Akbar. What's going on with your community, man? Is there something, you may need to do some more classes or something. What's going on? All right. I think, what would you say? Let me hear it nice and loud. Is homosexuality haram? Okay. Let me go to my first assumption, and I want you to now explore that with me, inshallah. All right? Hidden assumption number 1, right? So hold on to this, what we just acknowledged. Homosexuality is haram. I want you to hold on to that, and we'll get to the first hidden assumption, and we'll revisit this. The first hidden assumption has to do with identity. Okay? Now, when you tell someone that homosexuality is haram, you have a very clear understanding of what you're talking about. What is going in the ears of the recipient might be something completely different. Why? Because one of the issues that arises just based on the Western milieu that you're in is that there has been a conflation, a mixing up of 3 things: actions, desires, and identity. When you tell someone homosexuality is haram, what they're hearing is not the act of homosexuality is haram. Not that you have a desire and it's okay for to have a desire as long as you don't act upon it. That all is not there. What they're hearing, if they've taken on the identity of homosexuality, is that you are haram. Now you see, it's a subtle point, but it's very important to understand. Okay? So when we simply say homosexuality is haram, and part of the reason is because the concept of someone taking on a desire as an identity is a new concept. In fact, if you went back, let's say before the 18th century, and if you were walking around and you told someone, I'm straight or I'm gay, they would have no conceptualization of what you're talking about. A lot of Islamic law, Islamic Sharia, the fiqh, because the classical texts are not dealing with homosexuality as an identity, it doesn't map well to contemporary this kind of contemporary taking on an identity based on who you want to connect with. Okay? So the first thing to understand, the first hidden assumption is when you're speaking to someone, understand that if they're talking about homosexuality, they may have conflated identity, actions, and desire. Okay? Now, how did that happen? I wanted to get into that a bit quickly, inshallah.
As announced before that we strictly announced that there will be, this program is only for 13 and above. So if you have children with you, this was a disclaimer. It's really your call. I'll leave it up to the sheikh.
No, yeah, we announced that early, and I'm gonna, if that wasn't made clear, if you have kids that are younger than 13, definitely you want to. We'll leave that up to you guys, inshallah. Okay.
Yeah, so some of the contents and the words may not be appropriate. So if you have kids under 13, we request that you kindly take them.
Yeah, jazakallah khair. I had a brother that came up to me in the masjid the other day, and he said, "Are you the guy that's going to be speaking about LGBTQ?" I said, "Yes." He's like, "I hate that topic." So I was like, "Look, man, I hate it too. Like the fact that we have to talk about it, it sucks. Like I'm not exactly jumping over the moon because we have to speak about it. So, but we do, unfortunately. Okay, how do we get here? How is it that homosexuality becomes an identity? Where this concept of homosexuality becoming an identity actually starts back in 1867. There was a man, a specific lawyer in Germany by the name of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. And he's trying to push for legislation in Germany to legalize or to overturn anti-sodomy laws, because at that time, sodomy was illegal. So now he's pushing for this. He's writing pamphlets. He goes in front of a committee of 500 other jurists, and he's really trying his best to make a case to say that homosexuality, a person has this as their nature. In other words, they have no agency. They have no choice when it comes to this. This is a part of being born in the state. Now, of course, the environment at this time, you're talking about coming out of a period in European history where the main way of how you know truth is by way of science. Okay, because the shackles of the church have been cast off, and so now the language that you're going to employ has to be scientific. So he actually starts by saying there is a scientific basis to say that people are born as this thing. Okay, now he has a certain word for it. It doesn't really catch on. He gets a letter from another gentleman, right, Karl Maria Kurtbenny, and he writes to him, and they have correspondence. He says one of the issues is that the language that you're employing is not sitting well with the audience. You need something that's a little more scientific and a little more clinical. So he comes up with the term homosexual, heterosexual, right? And that's why they say that the first gay man was actually Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, because before that, this concept was absent, to have an identity as sex as your identity, okay? So 1868, he writes this letter. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire genealogy. I'm just going to be very short in 4 points, okay? Fast forward to 100 years later, 1969. You have, for those of you who study American history, the Stonewall riots. So there are these riots that go about at Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village in New York. And this is like a watershed moment for the gay liberation movement, right? The gay rights movement. Why? Because now, in view of everyone, these police now have raided the Stonewall Inn. People that were patrons of the Stonewall come out, they protest, they're going head to head with the police. People on the streets are joining in the protest. People from other bars and other inns are coming out to join the protest as well. And this it's part of the media and everything. Again, the environment, however, this is a time that you're talking about a lot of anti-war protests. Civil rights protests are happening now. Feminism and feminist and women's rights protests are happening now. So there's this kind of amalgamation, there's kind of like this mixing of, we're going to make this a rights issue, okay? And so you may have read, like, there was an article some time ago where they said that, gay is the new black, okay? In other words, because, being homosexual, whatever it is, it's immutable, it's part of who you are. So you can fight for civil rights in this and homosexual rights, gay rights in the same way. And there's this move to make them one and the same thing. Okay? Now, when you take a step back from this, you have to understand that, look, even if you say there's some sort of genetic code, let's assume that there was. Are we really saying that there is zero agency, no free choice of acting upon a propensity a person has? Like if someone has, for instance, that they have, let's say, in their family, drinking was a big problem. And let's say we get to the point where, yes, you have a propensity for alcohol. Does that mean that you have zero choice in the matter to choose to drink or not? Because this has serious ramifications. If you have zero choice, what that indicates, it moves you from a person of agency that can be held accountable to a victim. A victim that can now garner sympathy. And this was the entire move from the Stonewall riots, from the time of the Stonewall riots until today. To play the victim, such that anyone and any person that comes to critique the issue or even the moral issue would be castigated and would be classified as, like this a ravishing religious church-going dog, right? That's just backward and so on and so forth, right? But that didn't happen overnight. Now, very quickly, the Stonewall riots happened in 1969. They happened in the month of June. So every June now, you get a celebration or a recollection of those riots and a commemoration of those riots every single June, which now today culminates with Pride Month. Okay, so why is June Pride Month? Well, it's a throwback to the Stonewall riots. Okay, now move ahead to 1989. You have a book that is quite significant in the gay rights movement, right? And this book is called After the Ball: How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s. And it was written by Marshall Kirk and Hunter Mattson. They were, respectively, one was a neuropsychologist, graduate from Harvard, and one was an advertising executive who also graduated from Harvard. They write this book as almost like a manifesto. And to say that, look, our objective in this is how is it that we will, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing now, how will we garner sympathy for those people who are gay? Okay, how are we going to garner the sympathy? And interesting enough, there's a section in the book, and by the way, getting the book is a task. So if you go on Amazon now, I think last night I asked the audience for them to look it up, and I think it was $278 or something just to get it, if you can get it. And maybe you can get the PDF. I think that's how I was able to read it. But anyhow, so when you go through the book, there's a section I thought was really interesting, where they talk about this strategy of how to desensitize the American population. Okay? Now, the fact that they're talking about desensitization means that there is something inherently repulsive about that particular act, right? If I start getting into the details of that act, immediately you'll be like, we're talking about it in a masjid, right? Especially into like male-on-male intercourse and things like that. You can start imagining what sort of, don't imagine this, but yani, you can understand why that would be immediately repulsive, okay? And when we start getting into the medical literature and they start expounding upon some of the medical, biological, physiological risks involved with male-on-male intercourse, it really does. You have to take a step back and ask, like, why don't people know about this, right? You have, things like, like, for instance, people that engage on male-on-male intercourse have an 80% higher chance of contracting anal cancer. Okay? Now, you don't have to scratch your head and be like, well, I wonder why that is. Like, no, it's very common. Number two, there are certain stomach diseases which are related to the ingestion of fecal matter. Again, it's based on male-on-male interaction, right? And other acts that go along with it, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not trying to gross you out, but understand the concept of desensitization. The reason why they're talking about it in this book is because we understand, at least from an Islamic point of view, every human is born upon the fitrah. We have an innate understanding of what is normative. Okay, when I say normative, you can replace that for normal. Okay? You have just a general perception. If tomorrow there's people walking on their heads upside down, you don't just walk by and be like, oh, that's normal, and you keep walking. You have an immediate recognition, okay, something's wrong. In fact, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he says that every child is born upon the fitrah, right? In fact, there's the narration of the hadith in Sahih Muslim, where he says, "Ma min mawludin illa yulidu ala fitra." No one is born except they are born upon the fitrah, and his parents make him a Jew, a Christian, or a Magian. At the end of that hadith, he says, just as you see an animal born with its limbs intact, where you do you detect any flaw? Why would he mention that? Because if an animal is born without an arm, you recognize that as not being normal. That's not normative. And so you have an immediate recognition of things that are normal. Okay? When you walk into a room and something smells bad, you don't go through a philosophical syllogism to figure out how it smells and how it doesn't smell. You immediately understand, okay, that smells gross, right? So coming back to this particular book, they start to now employ this strategy of how we're going to get the American population. And I wanted to just quote a couple of things that they mention. And it's really worth a read. He says, so the authors say, the campaign we outline in this book, though complex, depends centrally upon a program of unabashed propaganda, firmly grounded in long-established principles of psychology and advertising. Now, I was just about to mention, there's a section in the book where they talk about, are we going to use logic or are we going to use emotion? In their estimation, only 10% of the American population would be swayed by way of logical arguments. They said 90% of the population, if you win the emotional battle, you've won the battle. In other words, if you can garner sympathy, then the person that goes against you, it doesn't matter if they have the best logical arguments in the world, because you've captured people's emotions, the logic doesn't matter, okay? And they mention this in the book. So he mentions this, the campaign that we outlined is based on principles of psychology and advertising. Okay, we mean, when we talk about this, that they have a 3-step process, okay? They have desensitization, jamming, and conversion. So in the step of conversion, he says, we mean conversion, and you really got to marvel at this, really. We mean conversion of the average American's emotions, mind, and will through a planned psychological attack in the form of propaganda fed to the nation via the media. Now, we see this very clearly today, but when was this book written, right? It was written 1989, and you are now perhaps living that very reality. When you go to Disney Plus and you're like, wow, they have a gay character, they have a transgender character, that didn't happen overnight. That's been slowly over time by way of TV shows to normalize the whole lifestyle in a sense. Slowly and as a protracted effort, okay? Anyway, so let me come back to the point. Actually, let me just mention one other thing. This stuff does not happen in a vacuum. There is immense amount of funding for that message to become commonplace, all right? As an example, I'll give you 3 really quickly. The National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. These are one of the smaller organizations. Their annual budget is $3.5 million, okay? International Lesbian and Gay Association, their annual budget, $10 million, right? The best one, the Human Rights Campaign. By the way, this is not human rights. They don't care about if a child's dying. They're caring about gay, specifically gay and lesbian rights, which they've classified and almost usurped, right? We want to reclaim again. Usurp the concept of human rights to say it's related to gay and lesbian rights specifically, right? And let's say by extension, transgender rights and so on and so forth. Their annual budget, $35 million per year, where that involves not just influencing, not just influencing the educational system, but government, lobbying, and so on and so forth. So this movement is not one that's just very haphazard, but extremely organized. And you now have to ask, what's the response from the Muslim camp, right? What organization that's spending $35 million for da'wah, right? If you ask, not that we need that, because a friend of mine once said, he goes, the funny thing is, kufr needs a lot of money to make it normal, right? Islam can be done very cheap because it hits right at the soul. Anyhow, okay. So our first hidden assumption has to do with identity. And this, what you want to do when a person comes to you and says, I'm a homosexual, right? Let's say even a Muslim comes to you and says, I think I'm gay. You want to have them take a step back for a second and ask them about, when you think about who you are you? Because there's something much deeper than just taking on an identity based upon a desire. When we ask the question, when I say something like, this is my hand, who's the my in the sentence? Right? When I say this is my foot, who's the my in the sentence? Let's say we get into a car accident, and may Allah preserve all of us, but if we lose our legs, do we stop being us? Right? Let's say we lose both of our arms, do we stop being us? What makes you you? Right? This is one of those ontological questions. What makes you you? You have an inner subjective state, which is your consciousness, which is not tied to your physical being. It's not part of your physical, it's not even in your brain, right? Sometimes people conflate these two things. You have an inner subjective state. Like, for example, Sheikh Tawqir, what is your favorite dessert? He's like, I like all of them. You don't have a favorite? Wait, what's your favorite food? Biryani. I should have guessed that, Yani, right? Okay. Now, when Sheikh Tawqir eats biryani, he can describe it to me. He can say, you know what? It's tasty, it's spicy, it's got this perfect amount of salt and so on, blah, blah, blah. He can describe it to me. Now, the issue is, I have no idea what biryani exactly tastes like for Sheikh Tawqir. Because I have to, in order to do that, I have to experience the biryani exactly as he experiences it. In other words, he has an inner subjective state where he's eating the biryani that I can never access. Only by him telling me, but even that, I only have an idea, right? Unless I become him. That is what we call an inner subjective state. Just to make it even more clear, when you and I are looking at, let's say, the color green, we have the linguistic word green. But how do you know what you're seeing is what I'm seeing? You have no way of knowing that. And that's what we call an inner subjective state, and that is part of your consciousness. Where does that consciousness come from? It comes from the fact that Allah puts a ruh inside of you. When Adam alayhi salam was created, when did the angels when were the angels ordered to bow down to Adam? When his body was formed, Allah said, okay, bow down now? No. Allah says that basically we fashioned him. وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. And when we put the ruh into him, then we ordered the angels, فَقَعُوا لَهُ سَاجِدِينَ. Now prostrate to him. Meaning, who you truly are is not just material matter. It has to do with your ruh, your soul. And your identity, if you cut yourself off from that reality, you're just talking about material desires that are housed in your body. And if you really want to talk about authentic self, right, for those of you who know what that term refers to, your authentic self, by necessity, has to be attached to the divine. If you truly understand, when we ask the question, who are you? Okay? So this young person, or whoever it is that comes to you and say, you know what, I think I'm gay. You want to now talk to this person and say, why do you want to take on an identity that's related to, your sex? You're much greater than that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves you as an individual. There's so much more to you than just who you desire to have sex with. And you start talking to this person about who Allah is and how that their primary identity, more than anything else, is one that's tied with the divine, more than anything else. And if you really want to take on an identity, that is an identity that should be taken on, right? So notice now, we started the conversation, is homosexuality haram? Because that's usually how the question starts, the discussion starts. Someone will come, maybe they're having feelings themselves, maybe they have a friend, right? Is homosexuality haram? Okay, the person says, yes, of course, it's haram. What are they hearing? My friend is haram, right? But now, when you now shift the discussion and say, no, it's not about that, it's about identity. This is a hidden assumption that we speak about and we don't really think much about. But if we don't understand it and we don't speak to it, we're in a lot of trouble, okay? So just to make it very simple. So typically how people understand identity, you have actions and desires, they're kind of in the backdrop, and their identity is related to that which is lowly, part of your desires, part of your material body, and that your identity is based on one that's sexual, right? However, what we're saying is that these three things are separate. Your desires don't define you. Okay? Who you want to have sexual relations with don't define you. That is a desire. And one other thing you may want to clarify is that Islamically, you are not held accountable for your desires. You're held accountable for you acting on those desires. Because all of us have desires, okay? And what would it look like if we just defined ourselves based on a desire, right? Someone wants to, let's say a guy wants to cheat on his wife, right? Obviously, no one here is going to do that. No one wants to do that, right? Of course. So someone wants to cheat on their wife. Now, just the fact that that thought comes to you for like 5 seconds, you're like, you know what? And then you might be like, A'udhu billah. Are you going to define your entire identity based on you wanting to cheat on your wife? You're not going to go around saying, Ana zani, right? No, it was a desire, and perhaps it was fleeting. Perhaps it was permanent. Perhaps it's still there and you're struggling with it, but that doesn't define you as a person. One of the issues that arises, remember I was talking about Christianity, is that they have conflated desires and actions. When they talk about, so you know the 7 deadly sins, it's very famous amongst Catholics. One of those sins isn't sex, it's lust. And that sin of lust, it's interesting that they take it as something, that's why the highest ideal in Catholicism is celibacy, right? Because the idea is that this in and of itself, intrinsically, the desire is a sin. And people that have had these desires are running in a backdrop like this, where Christians are telling them just having those feelings is a desire in and of itself, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Whereas the Islamic response is one that is more balanced. You are not held accountable for your desires, and you're not defined by your desires, right? Your struggle is part of why you exist on this planet, like we all struggle. All of us have certain desires that we have to go against, but none of us define ourselves by that desire, right? Rather, we struggle, and we understand that part of the purpose of this life is to struggle against those desires for the pleasure of Allah that elevates you. That's what tazkiyah means, right? Zakka shay. It means not only purification, it means growth. And by way of dealing with those desires and overcoming them, you grow as a person spiritually in your connection with the divine. Okay, so that was the first hidden assumption. How are we doing on time? Oh my gosh. Okay, 15 minutes. Let me go through the 2 next ones quickly. Hidden assumption number 2, ownership. One of the other assumptions that arises, and this is across the board, not only with the LGBTQ movement, but across what we call liberalism as an ideology. Okay. Now, all of us are swimming in the ocean of liberalism. And one of the foundational assumptions is that the human being owns themselves. Okay? So if you think about, let's say, protests at Planned Parenthood, and they have those placards where it says, "My body, my choice." What does that signify? I own myself, therefore I will choose what I want to do. Is that what Muslims believe? No. Rather, what we say is, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun." We belong to Allah, and to Allah is the return. The true owner is Allah, not us. But this hidden assumption, we start to get sucked into these discussions when we talk about concepts like freedom, equality. These are all, okay, yeah, remember I talked about how phrases can be, you can say something, you have something in mind, the other person has something in mind, but pretty soon, those ideas of freedom and equality and everything that comes along with it, which has this underlying assumption of self-ownership, you start to take those on yourself, okay? And so that's why when you look at conversations about gender roles and responsibilities, one of the reasons why Muslims have such a hard time with it is because they've taken on a narrative which says self-ownership. And the concept, like for instance, equality. You have a gender discussion about equality. And the main kind of, aspect of equality, we say that, we believe that every human is born equal. Men and women are equal. But equality of value is not the same thing as identicality of roles. And the fact that Allah created us as 2 genders is part of His hikmah. And how you connect with the divine is going to be based on your context. And that context is going to be, from one perspective, gendered. Right? Your lived reality as a woman is profoundly different than your lived reality as a man. Okay? And Allah knows that. Ala ya'lamu man khalaq. Does He not know what He created? Now we are coming at a time where we say, you own yourself, you decide what you are. So if you're biologically, anatomically a male, but psychologically you feel like you're a woman, no problem. Self-ownership. You own yourself, right? That's the underlying assumption. Now, just briefly talking about that, we have a concept of autonomy, which comes from the Latin auto, self, nomos, law. You give yourself the law, which is going to go into my third hidden assumption in just a second. In other words, you do what you want. You desire something, you do it. You do you. Obey your thirst. Constantly, even in media, it's constantly being, fortified. You own yourself, you do what you want to do. I thought one of the most interesting cases where this ran into some problems was a case that came out of Germany. Actually, I'm just talking about Germany today anyways. Nothing against any Germans, by the way, okay? Out of Germany, there was a case that arose recently where a man had put an ad in the paper to basically, he said, I would like to eat somebody, and I would like some people, that like to volunteer to be eaten. 200 people responded to this ad. He interviewed a few, and he selected a guy. So they both agreed, and he got it on video. The guy said, I freely choose. And he didn't pay them, by the way. It's not like the guy has starving children or something, and he's going to leave them $1 million. He said, no, just for the experience of being eaten. So he takes the guy, eats him, right? Puts him. The authorities find out. Now, at the time, there were no law against cannibalism. So they had to say, okay, what are we charging him with? Okay. Eventually, they came to the conclusion of they're going to charge him with murder, but it came up with a certain philosophical issue, and that is if you claim self-ownership and we own ourselves, you take a libertarian view of this. If he has a right and he owns himself, he can decide what he wants to do with his body, and if he agrees with it, who are you to interfere? This is a very inconsistent view of the world, by the way, okay, and for reasons like this, but it undergirds the entire argument. Self-ownership across the board. And when it comes to transgenderism, it's there. It's a hidden assumption. Okay? So, very clearly, we know from our tradition, in case this needs to be made clear, laysa dhakru kal untha. The male is not like the female. So in modern discourse, you find that they make a distinction between biological sex and psychological gender. In Islam, there's no distinction. Right? Our biology determines our lived reality as a male or as a female. Okay, and these things are distinct. So the negative term of are you cis normative, sometimes it's thrown at you, right, as if it's like a bad thing. You should own it. Yes, I am cis normative. Right? Because that is normative and normal. All right. Okay. So hidden assumption number 2, very very quickly. If we take this assumption to its tail end, what makes you a good owner of yourself? Especially when you compare yourself to Allah. Are you more knowing than the divine? Do you have more knowledge? Do you have more mercy? Like when we talk about the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah is more merciful to you than you are to yourself. He's maximally perfect in His mercy, right? The day of Arafah is coming. And on that day, the Prophet ﷺ tells us that Allah gathers the angels and he boasts about the people that are coming to Arafah, right? Coming there. And he says, look at my slaves, sinful, right? Disheveled, dusty. Amongst them would be people like the worst tyrants of this world, homosexuals of this world, people that did the worst crimes, murderers, right? Rapists, whatever. You think about the worst crimes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala boasts to His angels that these people are coming to me in asking for forgiveness, and know that today I have forgiven all of them. Who is more? Are you more merciful than Allah? Do you have more knowledge than Allah? Even in terms of morals, which is the next point very quickly, how much knowledge do you really have? How can you really take care of yourself if your sphere of knowledge is so limited? وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. We've only given you a little bit of knowledge. You're going to compete with the one who has a picture and all you have is a pixel. Right? So, what makes you a good owner in the first place? This in and of itself, when you start to plug away at it, starts to unravel very quickly. So the second hidden assumption has to do with self-ownership. The last assumption, that has to do with the concept of morality itself. How are we doing on time? 10 minutes? Can I stop right at Isha, or do I have to stop 5 minutes before? Okay, inshallah. All right, so I got the authorization from Sheikh. So, all right. Okay, we'll do it. I should be able to finish, I hope, inshallah. So last hidden assumption has to do with morality. Now, this is an interesting one because when people are talking about, let's say, human rights, gay rights, and things like that, they are making a moral claim. Okay? When we talk about morality, we can divide morality in that which is objective and that which is subjective. Now, this might get a bit philosophical, but I'll try to bring it home in just a second. If you, let's say, you go to the hospital and you see that in the maternity ward, a doctor has just finished an operation, he pulls out the baby and beheads the baby. Is that moral? What do you think? People, anyone agree with that? Like, yeah, okay. He must have had his reason. Who knows? He's a doctor, right? He's a rich doctor, so he must have definitely. No. Anyway, he beheads this, so you'd be aghast. You'd be like, wow, that's immoral, right? Like, how could he possibly do that? Now, if all of humanity agreed that that was moral, it's okay. Does it make it okay? Yeah? Anyone say yes? No, it doesn't. Okay. In other words, that act you are saying is objectively immoral, meaning it doesn't matter what anyone thinks about it. It's not limited to human mind and human emotion. It is outside of that. It's objectively immoral no matter how many people think it's okay. Okay? A moral that is subjectively moral, it's subject to other people and their opinions and your opinion and so on and so forth. When people make a claim, right? Homosexuality is okay. It's an okay lifestyle. It's okay to be transgender. They're making a moral claim. The issue is that if they say it's a subjective moral claim, then that means that claim could change. That morality could change over time. And this is one of the issues of, let's say, progressivism. So progressives, in their conception of morality, they think that morals can change over time, that you can get better morally over time. The issue with that is that as soon as you talking about the past, anything that comes out of the past is immediately categorized as immoral. They were just backward. They didn't know any better. In fact, I would argue that the Islamic tradition, when it comes to morals, doesn't hold the view that it's progressive, that we can progress in morals. In fact, we have a stance that we're actually regressive. Why do I say that? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Khairun nas qarni, thumma alladhina yulunahum, thumma alladhina yulunahum." The best generation is my generation, then the one after that, then the one after that. When we look at humanity and history, we say, no, there's a general regression of morals. And yes, there may be times when you have a mujaddid, right, a renewer that comes and kind of bumps up, but over time, there's a regress of morals, not a progress of morals. So the concept, but if you're going to say that morals progress, you're just saying that it's subjective and it doesn't have any teeth. If you make an objective claim, the only way you can make an objective claim is if you believe in the divine. Because that which is divine is outside, it transcends limited mind and human emotion. And you can have a moral anchor to say, no, we have a source that's beyond limited mind and human emotion, which is Allah. And so now your claim can be justified objectively. But if you take God out of the picture, all you're left with is subjective morals. And people are so, confident about their morality. I sometimes, I ask people, if we took you back in time, and let's say you were part of the transatlantic slave trade, and you happen to be a white, slave owner, would you look at all the atrocity and be like, you know what, this is wrong. I need to put a stop to this. Some people are really sure about that. They're sure about their morals. No, I would absolutely do that. Really? Would you? If you went back to Germany and you were one of the soldiers, one of the Nazi soldiers, how certain are you of your morality? Would you now say, hold on, they're throwing these people into gas chambers. I think this is morally wrong. Or would you be swept up in the moment and say, no, it must be right? Because you're at a time and a place and in a moment where the LGBTQ movement is considered perfectly moral. And your anchor to get out of that is to hold on to revelation. Because we are divine command theorists in a sense. We have divine command that allows us to transcend limited mind and human emotions. And so the concept of morality becomes one that's very important. And it's another hidden assumption that doesn't come to the surface. Okay? So with that said, where do morals come from? They come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So just to summarize very quickly, and we probably need a break now, right? Or how many minutes do I have? 3-4 minutes, okay. Just to summarize very quickly. 3 hidden assumptions, all right? What was the first one? Help me out here. Identity, right? We said identity was the first one, right? That you don't identify with your desires, okay? Second hidden assumption, what's the second one? Ownership, right? People claim self-ownership, we say no, we are owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Third one, morality. Where do morals come from? They come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you are more justified in these assumptions than your interlocutor, than the one you're having a discussion with. And if it comes to this, because that's really where you want that person to have the discussion, by the way. You want to put them in that pocket. Because now the discussion doesn't move to like, you know, let's say sexuality and this and that. It moves back to Allah. Who is the divine? Why is he worthy of worship? And that's essentially what our call is to Allah, to worship Allah alone and to believe in the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And once you move the discussion back, you have the upper hand. Because now the discussion moves from this particular issue and all of the socio-political, let's say even economic things that surround it, to one of theology and one of spirituality and existential questions. Questions about why you exist in the first place, right? And that's exactly where you want people to be and how they're thinking about this issue. So I'll go ahead and stop here, so give people some time to make wudu and stuff. And inshallah, we'll take it up after Isha, if that's okay. And I'll have a few concluding remarks, and we'll open up for Q&A, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
Allah khair. Barakallah feek, Sheikh Fahad. Thank you so much. Inshallah, we will resume after Salatul Isha. We're going to pray Salatul Isha in the back for sisters as well as the brothers. So inshallah, we're going to move towards the back. I want to request somebody to give the adhan. We're going to pray at 9:50, right after the sunnah prayers at about 10:10, inshallah. We will be back and we will continue from here. Jazakumullah khair. You can turn that on.